So based on what you're saying that we're spraying these chemicals on crops and they're becoming resistant, so it's getting harder to grow these crops because the bugs are getting them because the chemicals aren't working as well because they're adapting. So based on all of this, are GMOs a great solution that now we'll plant these GMO seeds, and one, they'll use less chemicals, and two, they will solve this problem. So are GMOs the solution to this, or a solution to anything?
No. Again, if you take a step back and say, what just happened here when we see insect resistance to pesticides, for instance, right? What just happened here? Well, we attempted to kill that organism, and we weren't completely successful. And the reason we weren't completely successful is because there was a really huge population of bugs, and we applied an incredibly strong toxin, and it killed almost all of them, but it didn't kill a few. Well, who were those few? Well, those few probably had some mutation for tolerance or resistance to that chemical. It may have slowed them down a little, but it didn't kill them, and it didn't prevent them from reproducing. Now, if there was a genetic basis to that resistance, that just got passed on to the next generation, except that we wiped out all of the competition that bug had, and we just handed them the keys to the kingdom. Here's a great big giant field that is food for you, and there's nobody else here eating it, so you and your descendants just take over. We just got insect resistance. But what did they do? We applied an intense stress in the form of a chemical, and that biological system overcame that stress in the matter of a few generations. If we take that chemical, let's say BT. BT used to be in a powdered form that was sprayed onto plants like grapevines where I grew up to kill something called the leaf skeletonizer. And the caterpillars would eat that, and they'd stop eating, and they'd get really sluggish, and then they'd die. It was the crystal protein that was produced by the BT bacterium. Now, if we just, it's a pain to spray that onto plants, and when it rains, it washes off. Here's what we should do. Let's take that BT gene, and let's put it in the plant. That way, we don't have to spray the plant. It's already in the plant. Anything that eats the plant will die. And actually, we don't have to use as many pesticides and chemicals anymore because the plant's making that. Let's step back. What did we just do? We took the chemical stress that was being used to kill the insect, and we put it inside the plant. Did we change it? No, it's still a chemical stress. What will be the response? The response will be to overcome any stress in the environment. It will kill any of the organisms out there that are susceptible to it, and the ones that don't die, those are the ones that are resistant. Just by moving the chemical from outside to inside doesn't change the rules of the game whatsoever. The result will always be the same, and it's always very predictable. Biotech is not a change to the rules of the game. It just moves where you put the chemical stress. That's all it does.
Yeah, just a quick, back to my Monsanto days. Yeah, so genetic engineering was the original name of all this stuff, but it's not really engineering because it was a very random process. Sticking in that crystal of BT was a very random process in the labs. And it was a trial and error of thousands and thousands of repetitions. So it's the same crystal, but it's not the same plant. It's now a new type of plant. It's a GMO. What else changed within the plant? Nobody really knew back then, and there hasn't been a huge amount of study, although there's more now, to say, well, how did the process of sticking this new gene change the plant? So we don't know everything there is to know about plants.
Yeah, I would add also, GMOs are actually a disaster in terms of trying to solve this cycle, because what they do is they actually, and again on a sort of adjunct basis, they maintain the system that's created the quote need for these pesticides and then the quote need for GMOs to begin with, which is the monoculture system, the large-scale industrial system. So you have the Gates Foundation and others pushing GMOs around the world, and in some very nefarious ways, I might add. I've been researching this for some different clients and groups where, you know, they go into universities, they develop think tanks, and they basically call them, you know, in pursuit of science. But they're really just pushing the GMO agenda. Like literally almost everything they produce is pro-GMO. And so it replicates that same system and create, you know, and again, it doesn't solve anything. And meanwhile, tons of pesticides are being used. That's the other myth that the GMO industry has put out, is that we're going to use this to reduce pesticides. And the reality is that glyphosate, for instance, is used in vast quantities while using GMOs on GMO fields. So it's like, this is not a solution in any respect, and yet what makes it even worse is that it poses as a solution while replicating sort of the traditions of the Green Revolution going back to the 1970s, which was that industrial agriculture production was the answer to what they then called third world hunger and poverty.
So just to repeat this question again, so in terms of right now, there's a lot of people saying GMOs are good and we need them. So if someone gave you only 1 minute to answer this, to explain what you just explained, you had 1 minute to say it, what is the simplest 1 minute explanation to explain why you don't believe genetically engineered foods are a solution and why the chemical is now on the inside and you're going to get the same results? Say it again in 1 minute in the simplest way if we had to explain this to people that needed a very simple explanation.
Well, I would say, first of all, that GMOs are entirely unnecessary to feed the planet. We already know that there's more than enough food to feed the planet. The evidence shows this constantly over time, every time it's studied. The issues are much larger than just GMOs. Meanwhile, they do not improve the environment. They enable the same kind of manufactured industrial monoculture system that has gotten us into this mess without solving anything in terms of environmental, sustainability, and they reduce biodiversity. So, there's nothing in it that we either need or should want.
Yeah, so from a greater public good point of view, there's no benefit and there is some risk. So why do we need to take this risk so that a few companies can profit? Essentially, that's the decision that was made by the regulators in the US, Canada, and a number of other countries.
They'll fail every time. They will fail. Then they'll be very expensive while they do it, and genetic diversity is reduced to 1. We go from having all the diversity necessary for our plants and animals to survive, we reduce it to 1. Every plant in the field is a clone, essentially, of every other. There's 1 plant out there, just 1. If anything bad were to happen, if there was a fungus, a bacteria, a disease of any kind, the entire crop is lost. Entire crop. That is the most inflexible, fragile. Our crops are made of glass when they're like that. We are setting ourselves up for failure with biotech. We're not improving the situation. We're making it far, far worse. We're creating a situation where failure is almost imminent by doing that to genetic diversity within our crop species.
What's the time frame you see before it becomes obvious that that's what happened? Are we a year or two away? Are we a decade away? How long do you think before there's adaptation to the GE crops?
How long? How long? It's already happening. I mean, it's not tomorrow, it was yesterday. It was years ago. We started this process in the 1950s. In 1951, a man named Harold Painter at Kansas State wrote a book called Insect Resistance in Crop Plants. It's a fascinating little book because it was at the very beginning of the DDT revolution. And he said that the plants themselves can resist the crops. We need to focus on the ability of the crop plants to resist pests. The genetic diversity within the crops enables them to do this. And I think it's an old little book, very hard to find, but it's fascinating reading, because in 1951 he was saying this. He was looking at, and he was referring to pesticides at the time too. He was well aware of what they were doing. We turned in about a 180-degree direction and ran as fast as we could the other direction. We started the process of killing agriculture about then, of putting us on this pathway that we are now starting to realize is really coming back to haunt us. The process began years ago. It's not that suddenly things are going to crash, it's that pieces of the puzzle are being lost. They're falling away, and we're left with less and less to work with. And the biotech example is a good example of one where if we go that direction, we're just completely jumping into that pond. We are throwing away pieces of the puzzle in order to get there. We're doing it intentionally. So there's no answer to that question when it's going to happen. It is happening now. And we need to recognize that, and we need to stop doing it.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, it's true. We've been losing seed diversity and plant diversity for decades. So this isn't a new phenomenon yet. It's a new iteration of a long-standing trend of winnowing out, humans actually on an industrial basis winnowing out the wonderful natural diversity that our food system provides us. And so in a whole range of ways, from super weeds to pest resistance and super bugs to a radically diminished diversity of seeds and seed varieties, and therefore crop varieties, we're already seeing the ramifications of that. And we should keep in mind that losing crop varieties also means it's an ecosystem issue as well as just a dietary issue, or a food enjoyment issue. It's like we're losing the different mechanisms that those other crops and varieties provide in terms of dealing with pests and nutrifying the soil. So, so those are huge ecosystem and biodiversity issues as well.